Welcome into the Simmons Scoop with Director of Recruiting for On3, Chad Simmons. What a day we had yesterday. Number one recruit, Jackson Cantwell, off the board, commits to Miami. But, last night I went back and Jackson Cantwell did an update on this channel with Philip Duke 6 months ago. He barely mentions Miami. He says in passing that they are a team that he's talking to, but then goes on for 11 minutes to really just talk about Nebraska, Missouri, and LSU. What did Miami do in these last, 3-4 months to get where they are today with Jackson Cantwell's commitment?
I think a big thing, Josh, is getting him back on campus this spring. For me, that's kind of where it started to kind of really, at least put Miami in that conversation that, he went back to Miami, he went back to Michigan, went back to Ohio State. Those were the three trips he wanted to get to unofficially this spring before he really started to think about decision timeline and even does he want to take 3, 4, 5 OV stuff like that. Getting back down there, seeing a spring workout, spending more time with crystal ball, mirror ball, getting a better, deeper feel for the culture, what they're trying to build there in the ACC. Obviously, the buzz around Cam Ward being potentially at that time the number one pick in the NFL draft, trying to use that as well to kind of show Cantwell where he can be, what he can do there at Miami. I think to me, that's really where Miami kind of initially made that move to kind of put themselves in that position to be one of those final hats on the table. And then things took off from there, from the conversations to, we know NIL is a factor there, to playing time opportunity. He loved the two-headed offensive line coach with Mirabal and Cristobal, both with O-line backgrounds. So I think the key turning point, though, for Miami, at least based on what I know and what I've been told, was getting him back on campus instead of going to, a place like Georgia or back to Missouri or something like that at that point, even Oregon at that point. He went to Miami instead, and Miami really did a great job of answering those questions on that visit and putting themselves in a better spot coming out of it.
Yeah, and there was times where it seemed like maybe Oregon was the front runner coming off some of those trips. Georgia certainly was a team that up until the last 48 hours, everybody thought that's probably where Cantwell was going to go. But in the end, Miami, Mario Cristobal just never backs down. Speaking of not backing down, I want to talk about a couple more important offensive line targets for the Canes. And they're all right there in the state of Florida. They're not necessarily from the state of Florida, but they're playing at IMG Academy. And we're going to talk about Kenyi Pepe right now, committed to USC over Miami, 6'7", 325 pounds, one of the most coveted offensive tackles in the country behind Jackson Cantwell. Is this one over, or does Miami still have a shot at Pepe?
Look, the kids come out now and say, hey, I've shut my recruitment down. I mean, what does that really mean? I mean, there's still conversations being had, and we know all of them have agents and their ears are always open too. So it's a different game in recruiting now. I would say that USC is in a very good position to hang on to Pepe as of right now. But like you said yourself, Josh, Mario Cristobal does not back down. He's not going to give up on a guy like that. Like you mentioned, Pepe's at IMG Academy right there in Bradenton, Florida. So easy to get to if he wants to get to a game, this fall. An easy trip for him from Bradenton to Coral Gables. But look, his family's on the West Coast. He's from the West Coast. He went back-to-back weekends to USC on his own dime earlier this spring, gave them a commitment. So look, Miami's not going to give up, but he's going to be a tough flip in my eyes for Miami.
All right. Now, another pair of big men from IMG, Johnny Jones and Brett Colajay, both have been on Miami's radar. Do you think the Canes have a shot to lock down either of these monsters?
Yeah, if I had to pick one out of those two right now, I like their position for Colajay. I think it's Miami versus Georgia. We kind of saw that with Jackson Cantwell and how that ended up a day ago, where Miami ends up victorious there for the 5-star plus offensive tackle from Missouri. Can they do the same for the versatile O-lineman at IMG Academy? Look, he's from Colorado, moved into IMG Academy, and I think he ends up, as of right now, somewhere in the South, either in that 305 in Miami or the 706 of Athens, Georgia. I think those are the top two schools. He's visited over 10 schools this year alone, so a lot of schools are in play, but I think Miami has a very good, realistic shot to keep Colajay in state.
All right, let's talk about a couple more in-state targets that the Canes are chasing. Now they got momentum. I mean, you land the number one player in the country. Recruits start to take notice. So let's talk about Derek Cooper, who's been taking some out-of-state trips, but we know the South Florida prospect has love for the Canes.
Yeah, look, they have Javion Mallory, running back committed from West Boca Raton right there in South Florida. They want to add a second piece to that room at running back, and I think nobody's higher than Derek Cooper. You can list other guys like a Jay Lamar in South Georgia. He's high on their list as well. But I think they start with the hometown kid right there, Chaminade Madonna. They recruit players from that high school, that power program in South Florida every year. They would love to add Cooper. Like you said, he's visited out-of-state schools like Auburn, Ohio State, Georgia, Texas, schools like that. This spring. He'll take a lot of OVs as well, but I think his recruitment has to start right there in his backyard at the University of Miami. He loves the coaching staff. He's been there more than any other school. It's right down the road. I think it's pretty easy to see. He's extremely tight with his mom and his family, so having his mom right there close to home, she'd be able to get to every game, obviously, at Miami pretty easily. I think that could be a factor in the end, but I think Miami's doing a great job. And look, they know it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. Could Derek Cooper, like other schools, higher on his list at different times? Sure. But in the end, in December, I think Miami has a real shot to land him as well.
All right, let's swing over to St. Thomas Aquinas right there in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and talk about On3's number 5 ranked corner, Justice Fitzpatrick. This sounds like another battle that's going down in the Southeast.
Yeah, I think, again, it could go back to maybe Miami versus Georgia. We don't talk a lot. Usually it's more Alabama, Georgia, Auburn, Georgia, schools like that. But it's, this one just this time has multiple guys looking at the same two schools and high on the same two schools. And where we start at here is the connection. Obviously, Justice's brother played at Alabama, Mika Fitzpatrick, who was on that staff. Mario Cristobal coaching O-line for Nick Saban. Kirby Smart coaching DBs for Nick Saban. So, look, he's a big family guy, and their entire family is involved, from Mika to mom to dad. All those people go on trips with Justice. They talk to the coaching staffs. It's not just about the right culture. It's about the right scheme, where they feel safe for their son being. Where does Mika think Justice can develop the most as a defensive back? So a lot of questions get asked to these different coaching staffs. And look, Miami is very much in this one as well. And I think he's pretty open, from Ohio State to Texas to Georgia to multiple schools like Miami. And I would say Miami has as good of a shot right now today going into the OVs, if not a little bit better than anybody else. But like you said, I think Georgia and Miami, again, are positioned well to be in this one until late.
All right, let's stay in South Florida. Wide receiver Calvin Russell. He's got a big visit this weekend to the Florida Gators. I think that's an official visit, but they're having a big visit weekend down there in Gainesville, and Russell will be a part of it. Do you view the Gators as the Canes' biggest competition here?
No, I would go up north to Syracuse. Look, we've talked about this before, Miami Northwestern. I think they put, I want to say, 4 guys at Syracuse last year in that class. Obviously, Calvin's been there 4 or 5 times already to Syracuse. Look, he got on the road this spring and did a lot of visits, from West Coast to Southeast. I mean, he saw a lot of different schools. I think Oregon made a pretty big impression on Calvin Russell. But I think you have to start with, Miami, as far as when you talk about his recruitment. He's from Miami Northwestern. He's been to Miami a lot. His mom is in the Miami Hall of Fame for track and field. She went to school at the University of Miami with the wide receivers coach, Kevin Beer. So they have that kind of relationship there as well. Kevin Beer, speaking of him, is one of the most, I think, well-liked receiver coaches in the game right now, as far as being able to bond with players and recruits and kind of talk about just life and things outside of football. So you're doing a great job with Calvin Russell. But look, Miami's going to be in this race until the end. You mentioned like a Florida. They have some ground to make up in my eyes. To me, Syracuse is Miami's biggest competition. And I may even give Syracuse a slight edge, maybe in his recruitment going into this next phase of his recruitment. But look, Miami's going to go hard after him. They have multiple connections other schools cannot offer Calvin Russell. So I think Miami has a great shot to make a pretty big and significant move in the coming months.
All right, we can't talk Miami recruiting without talking the tight end position. Miami has their sights set on two really good ones out of the California area. We're talking Mark Bowman and Israel Briggs. Miami takes a big swing here at tight end. Who do you think they have a better shot at right now, Bowman or Briggs?
Yeah, I would lean Briggs there. Both those guys, like you said, West Coast guys from Southern California. Briggs, one time committed to Arizona State, has taken some trips. Miami, I feel like from what I get out of his camp is, if not the top school, probably a top two with LSU right now. He loved his trip to Michigan here recently. Cal will get an OV. Texas A&M will get an OV. But I think Miami, if not leading, is definitely a top two school for Briggs, where with Mark Bowman, the five-star from modern day, I think right now Georgia and Texas are kind of setting the pace in that race, but he will take an OV that May 30th weekend to Miami. He had a very good visit in April to Coral Gables. That kind of opened his eyes and kind of put Miami in the position to get an OV. At the time, month and a half ago, I would have said Miami does not get an official visit from Mark Bowman. So him getting back down there early, mid-April changed that and kind of put them in the mix. But they have more ground, I think, to make up with Bowman. Not saying it can't be done, because it can, but I like, if I had to pick one they're in the better spot with right now, it'd be Izzy Briggs.
All right. And, after the landing Jackson Cantwell, nothing seems impossible for Mario Cristobal and his staff. So, Canes fans, talk to Chad and I. Who are you guys feeling really good about right now? Got to be a couple of them. Let us know. We're here with Director of Recruiting at On3, Chad Simmons, and we are here to talk uncommitted 5-stars in the top 15. We're going to get started. But, guys, do me a favor. Hit subscribe to the On3 Recruits channel. All right. Jackson Cantwell off the board, the number 1 overall, so we can put that one to rest. He's a Miami Hurricane, so we turn our focus to the number 2 player, also an offensive tackle, Emmanuel Ihenacho out of the DMV area down there in Baltimore, Maryland. And we're going to look at his RPM right now, and it shows Oregon surging at 85%, Maryland sitting there with just 6%. Do you agree with the RPM right now?
Yeah, I agree. Like you said, I think a keyword is right now with Ihenacho. Yeah. We know that one's been very fluid. I think Jackson Cantwell, obviously kind of a late twist over the last month or so, Miami, Georgia, Oregon, all that. But his recruitment from the beginning has been pretty straightforward about, top schools, top 6, top 4. Jackson was fairly, I don't want to say easy to cover, because at the end it got a little bit wild there. But with Emmanuel, his recruitment has been so fluid in different schools. And the thing about it is, he's been pretty open about coming out and saying, who his top school was, whether it was Oregon at one time, Georgia, Maryland, Oregon. So I think, visits make a pretty big impact, but I think, look, Oregon's lost some tough battles where they finished, second or third, for a guy like Jared Curtis with Georgia, Jackson Cantwell to Miami. I think they've kind of set their sights on now not missing this one. So I agree with the RPM of Oregon for Emmanuel Ihenacho.
Yeah, that recruitment is really going to come into focus now. I can tell the heat is going to be turned up on him. Speaking of offensive tackles, Felix Ojo, he's the next uncommitted 5-star on our list, and he's from the state of Texas, showing the recruiting prediction machine at 90% for the Horns, 2% for OU. He's going to be in Gainesville this weekend for a big visit to UF, but is there anybody right now that looks like they could swipe him from the Horns?
I say no. Look, he's taking the visits, and like you said, the swamp this weekend. I remember he had the Florida Gators backpack on back at the Under Armour camp in Dallas and got a lot of love from Florida fans. Of course, we posted pictures of that. He's been to Colorado. He's been to Ole Miss. I think, the school I've heard the most about, and he'll take an OV there too, is Ohio State. You can't ever count the Buckeyes out in recruiting race, but look, like you said, he's from Texas. He's been to Austin a lot. His family knows the staff. His entire family has been there with him on trips to Austin, Texas. For me, he's clearly Texas's to lose in this race. And right now, I don't think they lose him. So I agree with the on-3 RPM for Texas.
All right, we'll slide down to number 8, where we run into Tyler Atkinson. And he, much like Jackson Cantwell, kind of like There's been some of these recruitments where we think that Georgia is in line for them, and it just doesn't work out the way that everybody thought it would. Tyler Atkinson trending to Georgia on the recruiting prediction machine at 34%. We got Auburn at 12%, but is Ohio State kind of the dark horse in this one?
Yeah, I don't think he can be called the dark horse. Look, they're in this. They've always been in it. But like you said, Georgia set the pace in this race from the very beginning, going back to even middle school. He was already visiting Georgia, where he's been there, who knows, probably plus 15 times, to Athens. He sat down and broken down film with Glenn Schumann. He's had face-to-face meetings with Kirby Smart. His family's been there. He's very comfortable there. But look, I'm not as confident today saying Georgia is the clear favorite with Tyler Atkinson or for Tyler Atkinson as I was just 3 or 4 months ago.
Yeah.
He's been to a lot of places this spring, from USC to Oregon to Ohio State. Of course, Auburn, easy to get to in the neighboring state of Alabama for him here in Georgia. But look, Ohio State is very much in this. They could even be maybe viewed as, by some people I talk to, as the slight favorite going into the OVs. I know Oregon made a huge impression there as well. And then you have Georgia and you have Auburn, 2 schools that are closer to home in the SEC. Those are the 4 schools I hear the most about. So if the RPM favors Georgia, I don't feel so confident about that today.
All right, let's move down to number 10, where we have an uncommitted quarterback, 5-star Rider Lions. And after Jared Curtis went off the board last Monday, the picks started rolling in for Lions to Oregon, but maybe not so fast. Is USC still involved in this one?
Yeah, they're involved. I think, for me, I don't think my RPM's on USC. I don't know if they're the favorite school for him right now, though. I think it could be, depending on who you talk to, it's either BYU or Oregon. But which one is it? And USC's not going away. So I'm not ready to kind of shift mine, somewhere yet, because I don't know where I would go if I put it somewhere else at this moment. So I'm kind of riding still, no pun intending, riding still with USC. But look, his brother's there in Walker Lions. He's been there, who knows how many times. But what we know is Oregon's recruited him from day one. And we know, yes, he's 2026, but he will take the LDS mission and be more of a 2027 guy. He's not really looking too much at this class, but the next year's class. And so I think there's a lot of factors there. He had multiple family members went to BYU. His sister's even still there, so he has connections to Provo as well. I think this one could go one of 3 ways. So the RPM is favoring what, USC or Oregon today?
It's favoring Oregon currently.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably, maybe if I had to, agree maybe with that. I'm just not ready to move my pick personally to Oregon or BYU yet, because they're still, depending on who you talk to, he could easily end up at BYU as he could Oregon, or go back full circle back to USC, where I know he's been multiple times on the verge of committing to the Trojans,
Still a lot left in that one. All right, let's go to number 11, where we have 5-star running back Savion Hyder. Early in the cycle, I had him penciled into Michigan, but if you look at the recruiting prediction machine, you got Ohio State and Georgia at the top of this one.
Yeah, I think I agree with one of those, and it's not Georgia. I agree with Ohio State, though. I think they made a pretty big move this spring, getting him and his mom and his people back on campus in Columbus. I think in the end, look, Tennessee has to be taken seriously. Look, Georgia is doing all they can to stay in this race, but based on intel I get, Georgia's probably running 4th in this race behind Ohio State, Michigan, and Tennessee. Look, all 4 schools will get OVs. I think end of the day, though, I think this comes down to a Big Ten battle between, Michigan and Ohio State. I lean slightly towards Ohio State with the buzz I've gotten coming off a trip this spring. He did not make it to Michigan this spring. That doesn't mean anything. He still loves Michigan and Tony Alford and those guys in Ann Arbor. But I would agree with the RPM today if it says Ohio State. But this is going to be a pretty, I think, back and forth tight battle between them and Michigan. And I'm told by 2 different people, do not sleep on Tennessee. So we'll see what happens there in Knoxville in June on that OV as well.
Yeah, it's setting up for Hyder to have a really exciting summer with official visits, kind of going to shape this recruitment. All right, Let's move to number 12. We got Braylon Womack, the number 2 player in the state of Mississippi, the number 1 ranked safety in America, and he's trending heavily to the Buckeyes, who already have an outstanding defensive back class.
Yeah, they're doing a great job. They have a good shot to add Womack, an elite, safety there at Hartfield Academy in Mississippi there in Jackson. And look, there's other schools, in the mix, of course. Auburn is right there. I think at one time Texas A&M led for his recruitment as well. Yeah. He loves Vinny Sunseri at the University of Florida. He'll take his OVs. We've talked before, his sister now is playing softball at Auburn. That stays in the back of my mind in this recruitment, knowing that he could go there, make it easy for his parents to kind of see both kids at one place. But that's not going to be the biggest deciding factor in his recruitment. But look, he loves, Matt Patricia coming from the NFL, that scheme at Ohio State. He loves Tim Walton, has a great relationship there. Coach G, the safeties coach at Ohio State, another one that he has bonded with in Columbus. His family likes the people. They trust Ryan Day. And I think it's pretty clear Ohio State is setting the pace heading into this final phase of his recruitment. So I do agree with Ohio State being that team to beat going into these OVs.
Yeah, battling for the number 1 defensive back class in America. The Buckeyes could have it with Womack. All right, let's move to 13. Brandon Arrington. He's got a decision date set for July 5th. He's had a couple perceived leaders. The recruiting prediction machine still showing Texas A&M. I don't know who the leader is at this point. Do you?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of a little bit like, Hinacho. I mean, it's been very fluid, and Brandon, again, has been pretty open about saying, look, I went to Alabama. I loved it. They're my top school. A&M this time a year ago made a huge move last summer, early in the fall. They were the favorite. Oregon's been up there. USC's had them on campus multiple times. I mean, a lot of schools are in play here, but I was just out there a week ago, spent, an hour or so at Mount Miguel around Arrington, his coaches, his people, just having casual conversation about schools, what he's looking for, what's going to be important. And he didn't come out and say, hey, this school leads. But my takeaway was from that is that, look, A&M is doing a great job. A big thing for Brandon Arrington that he made very clear to me out there, and he has from day one, is that he wants to see a path to the field to make an impact early in his career. He knows his value, no matter where he goes, only increases if he plays, if he sees the field, if he can make an impact. And A&M's done a great job of connecting with him and his family, building that trust, and showing him a plan that he can play right away, or if he comes in and does his job. And so for me, I like where A&M sits going into this race. Look, Bama is loaded in the secondary, have a lot of guys coming back. We know Oregon recruits at a high level. USC has a monster class here in 2026 with close to 30 commitments. I think A&M has a great shot here, but look, Oregon's going to wow him on that OV. We know Alabama is Alabama. They recruit the West Coast extremely well. There's multiple schools involved, but today, right now, I like where A&M sits here.
Yeah, that's going to be a highly contested race this summer. All right, so at 14, we got Diabell. He's committed to the Longhorns. And then at 15, we have athlete Lamar Brown. I don't know. He was an offensive lineman when we first started talking about him. Now it sounds like Lamar Brown going to play defensive line on the next level. Regardless, 6'3.5", 285 pounds, currently trending to the in-state LSU Tigers. What do you think of Lamar Brown's recruitment as it stands today?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a two-team battle. I mean, he's going to take OVs. Miami's kind of a dark horse in this. Florida State's in there. He's pretty close with Gus Malzahn from UCF time and has that relationship. But unless something, I feel like, major changes over the next couple of months, when he commits in July, it's going to be either in-state local program LSU or SEC rival for LSU, Texas A&M. I think those are the two. A&M was the first school early last summer to work him out at defensive lineman. That kind of changed his perspective of position. He hasn't played D-line in high school for a couple of years. He's been all offensive line. He played there as a freshman. But A&M putting him on the D-line really changed his view of the program. That staff has recruited him as hard, if not harder, than LSU or anybody else over the last 9 or 10 months. But then I still go back to, look, LSU's the in-state program. Look, he was close to Brad Davis, the offensive line coach there. They obviously made a change with Bo Davis going to the NFL. On the D line, and now he's being recruited more as a defensive edge guy, defensive end from Coach Peoples and all that. So regardless if he ends up at O line or D line in college, it comes down to, I think, those schools. I think A&M really appeals to him, and some people feel they have the advantage, but I still fall back on the local program, the in-state school. He lives right there just outside of Baton Rouge. Mom's right there. She has a job in Baton Rouge as well. So I think they will be tough to beat, but Texas A&M is real competition for LSU in the local program.
All right, that's a rundown of the uncommitted 5-stars in the top 15. We're going to see a run on these guys here soon. A lot of names coming off the board in the next couple months. Thank you guys for joining us. Thank you, Chad, for joining us today. I know you've been a busy man.
Anytime. Thanks, Josh.